Okay. It's nice to be here today. Thank you to the organizers. And this is joint work with my colleague at UQAM, Catherine Hack, who's not here today, but she says hi. And I'm going to talk to you about social mobility in Canada and immigration. What can we learn from the Intergenerational Income Database? So I'll put up the usual disclaimer to make Benoit and Carole and Jean happy here. So you can read it. I'll point to the bottom line, which is work in progress, comments welcome. That's almost an understatement or an overstatement, I guess, because I was still looking at that stuff last week. And this is brand new. Apart from me, Catherine, and the analysts, you are the first eyes to see this. So your comments are very welcome. This is the beginning of the project. So I've been working on socioeconomic mobility over the past few years. And in recent work that I've done with Miles Korak and Catherine Hack, we were looking at moves up and down the socioeconomic ladder from one generation to the next. And we're comparing Canada and the US. So we have access to data in Canada, which I'll talk about more throughout this talk. And while we compare Canada and the US, we find that there's quite a bit more mobility in Canada than in the US. And so one of the measures we use that we're going to use today as well is the rank-rank correlation. So we have two generations, the parents and the children. And we look at the children at their income once they're young adults. And we can look at their rank in their own income distribution. And then we do the same thing for their parents. We look at the rank of the parents in the parents' income distribution. And then you can run a regression of one and the other, and you come up with a slope or a correlation coefficient between the two. And the higher that correlation, the more parental income rank sort of explains child income rank. So the stronger the correlation, the more it explains, and the more it means that as an adult, your place in the socioeconomic ladder is predetermined or fixed or explained by that of your parents. And so there's less mobility. So the higher coefficient means lower mobility. And so there's more mobility, lower coefficient in Canada overall. And it got me thinking about, well, is there a relation with immigration? So this being this conference, you already know that in Canada, about 20% of the current population is born outside of the country. And not to be forgotten, as our keynotes have actually mentioned, the importance of the second generation and the children of these people. So currently in Canada, 18% are what we call second generation immigrants when you use StatScan's definition of being a Canadian born, but with at least one parent that is born abroad. And those percentages are scheduled to rise according to projections. And then combined, it will make up about half of the population in the not so distant future. In the US, those rates are lower. And also, as we've seen yesterday in David Scott's presentation, the types of immigrants, especially in terms of human capital, are very different in Canada and the US. And so it got me thinking about two questions. So the first one would be, how do immigrants and non-immigrants compare in terms of their intergenerational income mobility in Canada? So take second-generation immigrants and their parents, and then third-plus generation, so Canadian-born with Canadian parents and their parents. You compare the two, what do you get? Are immigrants more, are children of immigrants more upwardly or downwardly socially mobile than the non-immigrants? And then also as an aside, how do non-immigrants in Canada look compared to Americans? So if you take Canadians and then you remove the immigrants and the second generation immigrants and you're left with the third plus generations, how do we look compared to Americans? Have we lost our edge and our advantage, so to speak, compared to Americans, given that our immigrant population is generally has high human capital, and the second generation often catches up to the first generation's potential. So in Canada, there's been a little bit of work done on this issue. And so, for example, work by Edemir, Chen, and Korak in 2 related papers, we're looking at the educational mobility from one generation to the next and the income mobility from one generation to the next. And so what they did, they compared educational attainment of second-generation children and their parent, and they find that there's a bit more mobility in terms of education for immigrants, second-generation children, than for natives, but no major differences found in terms of intergenerational income mobility. However, that work, due to data constraint, was mainly based on census data and on group averages. So they were looking at different children and parents from different source countries and looking at averages for those groups and comparing the two. So what we do is we exploit Statistics Canada's Intergenerational Income Database, or IID, who now covers the successive birth cohorts from 1963 and 1985. So I've done some work with this before, and what we did in the recent past is we added more recent birth cohorts to the data. What they are, they're sets of annual tax files on children and their parents. So talk a little bit more about the data in a bit, but because they're at the start, they're only tax files. There's a large number of observations because it's not as simple. It's the universe of the tax files that we can get for specific birth cohorts of children and their parent, but it's only limited to information that's on your tax return. And so you know where people live, you know how old they are, you know very precisely how much they make and by various income category, but that's about it. So you don't know if they're immigrants, you don't know their education and other things like this. So there's new data development underway, so being interested in this question, I've been talking with Statistics Canada, and Yuri Ostrovsky was here and we spoke yesterday. We've started this project of linking the IID with the immigration lending file and census data, but that's not available yet, but I got too excited about this and I still wanted to start working on this. So in the meantime, I've asked myself, what can we learn from the current version of the IID? And so what we're doing sort of a hacking trick. We're using the postal code, I'll come back to this, and then we're looking at census data and we're trying to see, well, in that area for these people, what's the sort of probability that these people are immigrants? So I'll explain. So we're sort of exploiting everything that we can from the current version of the IID while we're waiting for actual files that would tell us if you're an immigrant or not, and richer data. So I'm going to present my methodology, the data, and then the results that I have. Okay, so mobility measures. So I'm going to put them up there. This is nothing new. It's sort of standard stuff in the socioeconomic mobility literature. So there's different measures that you can use. Here I'm going to show you intergenerational elasticity of income, or IGE, which is basically the slope coefficient when you run a regression of log income of one generation on log income of the previous generation. So that's one thing. It's subject to a number of biases. I'm not going to get into all this. Another measure that we can use is the rank. So as I mentioned, so then you do the same thing, but instead of using log income, you use rank. And then you can look at transition matrices, and so we're going to use 5x5 transition matrices, where basically you compute the conditional probability of being in a certain income quintile for your distribution based on your parents' income quintile. So you have 5 columns for the parents and 5 columns for the kids, and then you have a 5x5 transition matrix. The data, the IID, so today I'm going to only focus on the latest birth cohort. That's all I've had time to do. So it's kids born 1982 to 1985. I have 1.3 million children in the database, and I'm going to use as an income measure total income. Not going to focus on a specific category, just total income. Now we have to define how we measure parental income and how we measure child income. And so parental income is going to be a 5-year average. So we're going to look at the total income of both the mother and the father, if they're present. We're going to add them up, and we're going to do an average over ages 15 to 19, when the child is age 15 to 19. And we restrict this to be over $500. Partly, when we look at elasticity, the zeros are going to drop anyway, so we're going to make the rank comparable to the elasticity. That's one reason. There's others. Child income, we're going to look at also a 5-year average. The more you average, the less you are sensitive to like random shocks 1 year. And because they're born in 82 to 85, the sort of last 5-year window that we can get is when the kids are ages 25 to 29. In previous work that I did looking at all birth cohorts, we found this to be quite representative. It doesn't change all that much after that, at least when you look at ranks. Okay. All figures are converted to $2016. That's fine. Okay. The new bit that we're going to use is the 2001 census data. So 2001 corresponds to the year that the children are linked to their parents in the tax files. So I don't have time to get into all the details of this, but for our kids, it's when they're ages 16 to 19. So think of this as late teenage years. In the 2001 census, 18.5% of the population are foreign born. And if you look at the parents, okay, here, the parents are going to be the one that are first-generation immigrants, and the children are going to be the second generation. So for the ages of the parents, so we have most parents are born between 1940 and 1970 for these kids. And so if you sort of restrict the census to be for people around those ages, you have 22.9%. What we're going to use is we're going to use the dissemination area in the census. The dissemination area is very small. In the city, it can be a block or two, and it covers all the territory. There's 50,000 plus dissemination areas in Canada. In our data, the average, overall, the average population in Canada is 590, and in our data, it's 120 observations. Okay, and so we're going to look at the dissemination area. We're going to compute the fraction immigrants for people born between 1940 and 1970, so the age of the parents, in that dissemination area. And then what we're going to do, we're going to assign this to our kids in the IID, and then we're going to be able to say, do they live in an area where there's virtually no immigrants versus more immigrants? And we're going to use the rank, the percentile rank of that fraction immigrants, and the quintile. So we're going to split it in 5. And here you get the cutoffs. And so basically, if I talk about the bottom quintile, the fewest immigrants, it's less than 2.9% immigrants in your dissemination area. And then when I talk about the top quintile, it's more than 40%. So I don't precisely identify who's an immigrant or not. I think it's probably more accurate looking at the bottom quintile, because it means no immigrants. And so the top, it's like you could be an immigrant, or you live in an area where there are a lot of immigrants. Okay. In case you're wondering, this is the distribution of fraction immigrants. So there's obviously a big spike at 0. There's places with no immigrants, and then it goes all the way to 1. All right. So here's the first sort of main finding. The first column here is for all of Canadians, so everybody in our data set, and then it's split by quintile. The top row is the elasticity, the bottom row is the rank correlation, and Q1 is that fewest immigrants, and so the non-immigrants and up to 3% in your dissemination area, and all the way to Q5, okay? So if I look at Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, I see a decrease in those coefficients, meaning an increase in mobility, right? And so the higher the coefficient, the more predetermined your log income or your rank is. And so looking at the rank, I have 0.29, and I go to 0.24, 22, 0.21. So it goes down. It goes up a tiny bit by Q5. So it seems like the area with the fewest immigrants are the least mobile, and it goes down, and then a little bit more at the end. I was a little bit puzzled by this because I was expecting it to be like monotonic. It's not the case. you can see the same information in another way. So here it's the same thing, but instead of splitting by quintile, we look at for each percentile rank of the fraction immigrants. So now I split my dissemination areas into 100 bins, and I run the regression 100 times. Well, not quite 100, because the first one here covers a few more percentiles. But anyway, so we can do this for the elasticity or the rank, and you get something similar that is going down like this, and then a little bit of an uptick there towards the end. So again, it got me, it's not quite what I was expecting, so it got me thinking. I started digging a little bit more. And so here's where we're moving to the transition matrices. Okay, so this is not quite a transition matrix yet. Here I'm just looking at by quintile of fraction immigrants. Okay, so here on the x-axis I have the number 1 bar is the places where the fewest immigrant, a little bit more to the most immigrants. So I'm going to spend some time comparing 1 and 5. Okay, and what I have on this graph is the distribution of parental income. Okay, so if I look here, bar 1, I can see that in the areas where there are the fewest immigrants, so where basically most people are native born, if this was all the population, I'd expect 20% in each category, because it'd be just the distribution of the parental income. It's split into quintile, not very interesting. I'd get 20% each. But here I can see that I'm slightly overrepresented at the bottom, a little bit more in the 2 middle categories, and then under 20% in the top. And specifically, I got much fewer at the very top of the income distribution. And this sort of like from 1 through 4 goes from a bit like more at the bottom, fewer at the top. But I look very different when I look at the area where there are most immigrants. So when I look at this last bar, I can see that almost 28% of parents in the areas where there are more immigrants are themselves at the bottom of the income distribution. Okay, so there are more poor parents in the more immigrant areas. Okay? And then I can do the same thing for children, and then my next slide is going to be putting them together, right? So I can do the same thing for children, and if I look at the areas where the most immigrants, if I can flip back and I go here, okay, so I used to have 28% of kids whose parents were at the bottom of the income distribution, and as adults, those kids, about 23.5%, are themselves in the bottom income quintile. So they are moving out of this a little bit of the bottom income quintile, and that's a little bit of what's going to happen here when we look at the transition matrix. So in the interest of time, I could spend more time talking about this, but in the interest of time, I'll show you my transition matrix. This is like the first time I tried to show it like this. Really, you can show it as a 5x5 table, but I thought the bars would show, it's the same information. Those numbers are the same. It's just, you can see a little bit where they end up better, I think. For this chart, I'm only showing you immigration quintile 1 and immigration quintile 5, so the least immigrants and the most immigrants. And so if I look at the most immigrants here, now here the x-axis is the quintile of parental income. So 1 is the ones at the bottom of the distribution, the poorer, and 5 is the top. And the height of the colored bar here and the number shows the conditional probability of being yourself as an adult child in the bottom quintile, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Okay? So that 33.7 here is if I live in a heavily immigrant area and my parents were in the bottom income quintile, I have a 34% chance of staying in that bottom income quintile myself as an adult. And I have, it goes up here, and I have a 10.6% chance of leaving the bottom and going all the way to the top. Okay, so this is how I read this. Now I'm going to compare these two, and I'm going to see that for the children of poor parents, so if I'm in the first column here, the probability of being in the bottom income quintile as an adult is a little lower for children of immigrants than it is for non-immigrants. But if I look at all the other sort of like the probability of staying at the bottom for all the other bars, it's much higher for immigrants than it is for non-immigrants. Okay? So that means that the children who grew up in those heavily immigrant areas themselves end up in the bottom income quintile, sort of regardless of their parental income, much more than non-immigrant children, or much more than children who grew up in areas with virtually no immigrants. Okay. I know it gets convoluted until we have actual data that identifies immigrants and non-immigrants, but anyway, that's life. The other parts of the distribution, though, are sort of similar. And so if I look at the probability of moving from the bottom to the top, you have for non-immigrants 10.6, for more heavily immigrant 10.6 as well. Same for the probability of staying at the top if you're born at the top, 30%, 30%. So what I can see here is the movements down that are more prevalent for children of immigrants. Another way to sort of see this, here's a type of bin scatter plots where I look at per parental income percentile rank. So the x-axis is the rank of the parents, and the y is the average child percentile rank. So this is it's a way to represent the rank regression. Okay, and the line here is that rank regression, and the size of the circle is proportional to the number of individuals in that category. And so what you can see is that for you can sort of see here that there are more parents for immigrants. It's in immigration quintile 5. So on the right is for the more immigrant areas. There are more parents here at the bottom of the income distribution. Those circles are a bit larger than the ones here. Okay. But the circles there for the non-immigrants are way below the line, and so they're doing a little bit more poorly when they have parents that are really poor. But elsewhere it looks sort of similar. The slope is a little, probably because of those guys, the slope is a little sharper in immigration quintile 1, which is the first result that we saw, but not by a dramatic amount. So that's another way to sort of visualize the information that I've showed you. Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize and tell you what I'm going to do next. So mobility is lowest for the least immigrant areas, and the rank slope for that immigration quintile 1 is 0.29 compared to 0.34 in the US. So it's above the national average, or if you take everybody together, but you still don't reach sort of like US levels. Other points to take away from this is that the parents in the most immigrants areas are disproportionately themselves at the bottom of the income distribution. Their children are a bit more evenly distributed. Okay, so I think that's how you see some more higher mobility for immigrants in that situation. But the children of parents in most immigrants area are more likely to end up at the bottom of the income distribution for every parental income quintile, except for the poorest ones. Okay, so I think there's still we're still trying to understand what's going on here, and what this means in terms of public policy and things like this. One thing, though, that it's not up on the slides, but the differences aren't very large, although they're statistically significant because I have 1 million observations, so the standard errors are pretty small. So even a small differences tends to be statistically significant. It's not like we're not doubling, we're not halving. We're still within that sort of band of quite mobile society when you look at international comparisons. Okay, so it's nothing like super dramatic. And it looks as though the children of immigrants are quite well integrated into the society apart, and then that's where we're going to dig and figure what's going on here. What still to do, what I've shown you here was only for the younger birth cohort that we have in the IID, so we haven't done it for the other and older birth cohorts. We haven't incorporated other information that we could, even from the census, even without having linked files. So from the census, we know other information like source country mix or education. So this is something else we could look at. Eventually, we're hoping to actually have access to those linked data files where we could specifically identify immigrants, because as you've seen in the Q5, we have 40% and more of immigrants. So there's some areas where you're really close to 100%, but other areas no. And so then what it means is that we're pooling together children of immigrants and children of non-immigrants, but who happen to live in those high migrant areas. And so we don't have the leverage currently to do this. So that's it. Thank you. I welcome your questions.